morning. Thank you, Michelle, for joining us, and thank you all for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you for everyone for being here. I appreciate the intro. I think it could have been 2 sentences of just, most importantly, Michelle's a mother of 2 teenage girls living in Fairfield County and dealing with all of this just like everybody else. So all the lovely other things that I've done and some of the nice training is important, but I think the most important criteria and credit to my name is being a mom, trying to deal with this. One is here, and it's not quite the same as if we're all in person, and I miss being in person and seeing everyone, but we'll try and make it interactive even though it's via video. There are some questions I'm going to ask, and I'd love some input, and if people have questions or comments along the way, don't feel like you need to wait till the end. Feel free to unmute and ask them, or feel free to use the chat function. I'm going to share, I've got some slides to just help guide us. All right, can everyone see that? Hopefully. So I want to just start today. Now I just have to get this to work. There we go. So this is one of my favorite little cartoons of Waldo saying, "No one ever asks, how's Waldo?" So I actually wanted to start today by asking, how are all of you? And asking if anyone would be willing to share via chat, via unmuting, just sharing a little bit in terms of how you are feeling, even just this morning. It doesn't have to be a big description of how you felt during everything, but just right now, this morning, how are you feeling?
Tired.
All right.
I say tired.
Tired's a good one. Well, let me ask this. Has anyone already laughed this morning? Maybe already cried this morning? Maybe already yelled this morning? Maybe even vowed, woken up, said, you know, today's going to be the day. I'm going to be calm. I'm going to be cool. I'm not going to let things get to me. And then maybe 10 minutes later, half an hour later, as you're trying to wake kids up or get kids out the door, broken that vow? Sound familiar to anybody? You know, I think the question of how are you feeling, there are a lot of emotions that we experience every moment, every day. And we don't feel just one thing at a time. We're not purely happy or sad. You know, we can be upset about something, but also still manage to laugh at a joke, or we can be really happy, but still feel a little bit sad or have a bittersweet feeling. And it's kind of amazing when you think about it, how many emotions we feel moment to moment and all the things that can affect those emotions. You know, sometimes we wake up in not a great mood and we don't totally understand why. Sometimes we wake up feeling great and we make that vow of, I'm going to be calm, I'm going to keep my cool today, this is going to be great. And then whether we stub our toe or we come downstairs and our dog maybe had an accident, or our child is sort of uppity as they're getting out of bed. And it's amazing how that can impact how we feel. And so our feelings sort of, they start within us, but then they're so influenced by all the things going on around us. And this is another funny cartoon. Now this came out well before, this was pre-pandemic, that often we feel a lot of stress. You know, I think if we shifted those numbers, I think during the pandemic right now, it might be 10% water and 90% stress. That there's a lot of emotion going on, not only because of pandemic, because of back to school, because of so much things going on, and trying to manage those emotions can be really challenging. The other thing we think about feelings and emotions is we show and share them in lots of different ways. And we feel them in lots of different ways. You know, sometimes feelings they don't just stay in our brains, they don't just stay in our hearts, they go through our bodies. And a lot of times the way we hold ourselves, sometimes you can just tell by looking at someone, sometimes you just get a vibe. And again, these emotions are really interactive. They change all the time because we can influence other people and they influence us. And it's hard to contain emotions. You know, I am 49 years old. I've been working in the world of emotions for half my life. I think I understand them pretty well, but there are some days I wake up, I don't exactly know why I'm feeling what I'm feeling. Sometimes I might feel I'm off, but I can't always in the moment go, oh, I know exactly why. Well, this thing happened, and then I read this thing and this thing. Sometimes it's hard to identify what we're feeling and how we're feeling, and we don't always know what to do with it. And I think the other thing is that we can all benefit from figuring out better ways to manage our emotions and express our emotions. And again, not just children, but as parents themselves. When we think about how complicated emotions are when we're adults, now we think about for young kids, how complicated emotions can be. And I thought these pictures, I used to actually put pictures of my kids up, and now they're old enough. They're like, please don't do that anymore. I actually had a great picture of my daughter. She was like making this great face, and it was like every emotion you can imagine. And when she hit her teenage years, said, Mom, you got to take that slide out. So, but I think these are common faces and expressions that sometimes we get. There's that sort of, and the little girl of just like so much emotion with the balled fist. There are kids going at it, and sometimes there's just sort of a child who's sort of had it, of being overwhelmed by emotions. And I think it's important to remember that younger kids, they feel a lot of the same emotions we do, but they're not as skilled. They're not as adept at being able to express that. One of the most common phrases I think kids, especially 6 to 12, but also 12 to about 20 utter is, I don't know. And as adults and as parents, we get really frustrated when children say, I don't know. But I don't know is often the most honest answer a child can give us. What happened? Why'd you do that? What are you feeling? I don't know. Because often it is hard to put that into words. And if we can think about ourselves as adults, again, that process of where something's off, you have a feeling, but the process where you can identify exactly what you're feeling, be able to articulate it, be able to clearly not just own it and acknowledge it yourself, but convey that to someone else, that takes a while. And when we think about young children, they don't have the verbal skills often, they don't have the social emotional skills to really understand the nuances. And sometimes they may know what they're feeling, but they may not have the words to say it. Sometimes they may just be overwhelmed and not even be able to identify what they're feeling. So I think it's important that we remember as adults, it's really important right now to tap into and understand what they're feeling. But we have to kind of rethink our language and our approach to asking kids about it and how we have those conversations. And unfortunately, it'd be great. This is one of my favorite cartoons. I'm about to throw a tantrum. What are you doing? Wouldn't it be great if our kids could let us know? So Mom, just want to give you a heads up. No, it's Wednesday morning. I think Thursday at 4, I'm going to have a meltdown. Just want, can you mark that on the calendar? Or, Mom, what's your day like? Because I know I'm going to have a meltdown, but can you let me know when it'd be good for you? Because I know you've got stuff to do and dinner and things like that. So, you tell me, because I'll schedule it when it works best for you. Unfortunately, they don't do that. I think sometimes as parents, our radar, especially right now as we're heading back to school, many of us know, oh, it's coming. Again, I have 2 teenage daughters. I knew with both my girls, that first few days of school, there were definitely going to be some meltdowns. Some came earlier than I expected, some came later. So sometimes we have a sense it's brewing, but unfortunately, it doesn't always work in terms of the best timing. When meltdowns and emotions often bubble up and happen when they're most inconvenient. Sometimes it's just as we're about to leave for something. Sometimes it's just before the company is supposed to arrive. Often it's right as you're supposed to walk out the door to school. Many times it's at the end of the day when you're exhausted and you're ready just to say, I'm done for the day, and that's when it is. And again, it's really hard to try and manage all these emotions. And then there's a pandemic. Which tends to, unfortunately, escalate our emotions, while it also compromises our ability to manage those. When we really think about COVID and what's gone on over the past many months, it really is a perfect storm because it hits at so many things, at concerns about physical health, social emotional health, psychological well-being, financial stress. I mean, it really hits every button we possibly have. And understandably and sort of rightfully and reasonably, it raises all our emotional stakes. It's sort of, the air is almost thick with it. But it also really taps out some of the resources we have to deal with emotions, whether that's, you know, the ability to socially engage and get out of the house and do things, which tends to give us a break and an outlet. That's been restricted in many ways. You know, some of the things that we used to do that gave us joy, even some people for going to exercise class or being able to go out with friends. Now, those things have become layered and loaded. Some we can't do, some we can do, but they have to be very careful. So, you know, there's a reason many people right now, you know, the first word someone said when I asked how you're feeling is tired, both in terms of talks I've given in workshops and in my own private practice. Exhausted is the word I hear most often, that is the thing most people are feeling, of they're just exhausted. And some of that really is the intensity and sort of the wear and tear of how intense these past months have been and how much they are weighing on us emotionally and how much they've shifted what we can do with our emotions. And then there are the masks, which really complicate everything. You know, imagine if I'm giving this talk and now I'm doing this. So first of all, I'm hard to hear. You probably can't hear me very well. And then, am I smiling or am I laughing right now? You know, how expressive are my eyes? And again, now on video, you can't even see much of my body. You can see it from here. And probably many of you couldn't even hear that because it was super muffled. But when we think about it, when we think about how we show emotions, how we share emotions, how we read emotions, masks are really complicated. They muffle some of those sounds depending on how big the mask, and this was a big one. They really cover a lot of our cues, a lot of the things we look for. And then we think about video too. Well, now you've lost more than 3/4 of my body language. So what are my hands doing? Are my hands in fists? Are my hands crossed? Am I relaxed? What about if I'm someone who's not expressive anyway? You know, it really does complicate our ability to read, to show and share. And that's really complicated for children as well. You know, when you think about many people have seen the How Am I Feeling posters that have all the faces like, this is happy, that's scared, this is sad. You know, we think our faces are what we cue in, especially as for young kids. And often children really do look to those individual features. If we're covering up half of those features, and some people have very expressive eyes and some people don't, it really makes it much harder for children and for adults to be able to tell what other people are feeling. It masks a lot of the cues we look to. Now, the more we recognize, the more we understand the nuances of emotion, faces don't always actually, and people that are happy don't always smile. People that are angry or upset don't always frown. In fact, many of us, if you think about, I can be really upset, but socially I know to put on a smile. So maybe it's hard to tell. You know, there are some people that are quiet, mad people. There are some people that are really loud and obvious mad people. So we do show and share emotions with a lot more than our faces, but they are kind of the prime thing we look to. And especially for kids, that is what they tend to cue into. And one of the challenges as adults I think we have is, it's both a challenge but an opportunity right now, is to use this to remind our children there are lots of different ways, lots of other body parts, lots of other cues we can look to for emotion. And as parents, we can kind of encourage our kids, you know, look at people's eyes. Sometimes you can tell them with their eyes, look at their body language, you know, look at how people are carrying themselves. If you think about mad and stressed, our, you know, shoulders tend to go up. We tend to hold ourselves in fists. The body language is much more stern versus like, no, come on, you know, it's a happy and relaxed tend to be a much more giving, a different kind of energy there. And we can even, when we think about walking around with people in masks, we can use our voices too. We can use our tone to try and be a, hey, how are you? So even if this is blocked, you kind of hear a different tone of voice. And especially with young kids, we can help them even when you're walking on the street, when you're at the grocery store. You know, you can even play games at home with a mask to kind of cue them in and sort of play a game of, okay, guess how I'm feeling even with my mask. And if they say, I can't tell, I can't see your mouth, well, look at my hands, listen to my voice, look at how I'm moving around, to remind them that there are other things we can do. And in fact, there's, at the very end, I have a little slide with some resources. The New York Times, I think it was just a day or two ago, actually published an interesting article talking about, especially for young children, even for infants, how this idea of wearing masks, how it does complicate things somewhat for young children, but it also, there's a lot of other things we can do to help children focus on other aspects of emotion. So I think also what gets really complicated right now for us as parents is, you know, we are constantly, if we think about ourselves as teachers and models and mentors for our children, especially around social emotional learning, we need to be very fluent in the language of emotion so that we can teach our children these things. So we have to kind of simultaneously recognize and acknowledge our own emotions, our triggers, our reactions, and then consider the same thing for our children and kind of simultaneously think about ourselves, think about theirs, and then do that really hard work of yours, mine, and ours to kind of disentangle, okay, what are they feeling? What am I feeling? Where am I? Where are they? How are we doing that? And you'll see I put a little asterisk by children here because we really do that not just for our children, but for our partners, our spouses, our siblings, our colleagues, our parents, our neighbors, kind of everyone else we interact with. That constantly trying to figure out, okay, what's mine, what's yours, what's ours? And are you really mad at me? Or is it I'm kind of off and I'm sensing this? Or wait, are you just having a bad day that has nothing to do with me? Or maybe I did do something, and how we tease apart that. And that is really, really hard to do on a good day, on a pre-pandemic day. But now when we add in the fact of we've all been kind of stressed and compromised for a while. Some of us are wearing masks. There's a lot of uncertainty in the air. Trying to disentangle all those cues and do all that is really, really complicated. So I just want to pause for a moment because I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking and just see, are there any specific comments or questions at this point that people have that we can address? Because my hope is to make this interesting and informative for you all. So I'm just going to take a pause and see, are there any comments or questions that people have?
Can you elaborate more on either how or what it means to entangle your feelings from other people's or your reactions from other people's?
Sure. So, and this is one of the hardest things, and it's sort of a life's work, if you will. So we all have our buttons, if you will. You know, if you can kind of think about what either stresses you out or what upsets you or what makes you angry, we all have things that we are particularly sensitive to that are our buttons. My buttons may not be the same as your buttons, and my husband's buttons are different than my buttons, and my child's buttons. You know, so I think when we think about social emotional learning and emotional well-being, self-awareness is really kind of the baseline skill. And part of self-awareness is knowing yourself, knowing kind of your emotional triggers, knowing those hot buttons of yours, knowing kind of your soft spots, knowing how you tend to react, knowing your sensitivities. And the more we know ourselves, the better able we are to kind of interface, interact, communicate with other people. So some of it really is, you know, I'm trying to think of a concrete example. For some people, you know, the idea that someone would roll their eyes, or the idea that someone would, you know, roll their eyes, ignore you while you're talking. For some people, that's kind of a button. It's like, I find that really disrespectful, and that really is dismissive. I don't like that. That sets me off. For other people, they may go, whatever, it's just an eye roll. It doesn't bother me. So if I'm one of those people where, and maybe it's in part because in my family, that was something in my kind of the way I grew up, it was like, oh no, an eye roll, that's the biggest sign of disrespect, versus maybe I was in a family where no one cared if you rolled your eyes, it wasn't a big deal. But if I'm someone who, wow, an eye roll I find really disrespectful and bugs me, and I'm maybe with my children, maybe with someone else, I get a little of an eye roll, that's my button. So I'm gonna go there really quickly of, that's really disrespectful. How dare you? What's that about? And kind of knowing that, we impose some meaning on it. Again, I think that's really disrespectful versus for someone else, it might not have meant all that much. Some of what we can do there is kind of say, I have to tell you, when you roll your eyes at me, it gets me really angry and upset. Like that's like a big sign of disrespect to me. And it really bothers me. And man, I think about when I was a kid, oof, I did that. My parents would have lost it at me. And it's not necessarily that we have to keep all that to ourselves, but sometimes even just letting, whether it's another person or a child, know that, and kind of talking through of, okay, so when you do that, it really, really gets to me, I have to tell you. So please, like, with me, it's okay if you do that with your friends. It's okay if you do that with someone else. It doesn't bother you. But with me, like, oof, that's really hard. I'll share another example of also partly with that disentanglement is we tend to impose a lot of meaning on things. So for example, if you and I are going out to get a pizza, let's say, and I like vegetables on my pizza, I like mushrooms, I like spinach, and you like pepperoni on your pizza. If I say, hey, so let's get a pizza, I really like spinach, and you say, oh, I'm not really a spinach fan, I like pepperoni. I don't make a value judgment, right? I don't go, what is wrong with you? How could you like pepperoni and how could you not like spinach? Like, oh, so disrespectful, I can't believe it. I probably say like, okay, we like different pizzas. So what are our options here? We could do a pizza with half pepperoni, half mushrooms. We could get 2 separate pizzas. Like, what do you want to do? Do you care if there's a piece of pepperoni on mine? Do I care if you care if there's a mushroom on yours? We have like a basic conversation that's not imposed with value meaning. But when it comes about emotions sometimes, when it's about feeling, we often start taking things really personally. There's a lot of like respect and meaning of like, what do you mean you're not upset about that, right? I'm telling you a story about how this kid said this to me today, or, the cashier gave me a look and I'm so upset by it. And you say, oh, really? It's kind of like the pizza idea of, okay, so you had a different experience, you had a different reaction versus how could you not get upset? How could you not get angry? And this often happens as parents, as partners. This happens all the time where one partner's really upset about something, the other isn't. And we take it very personally. We feel kind of disrespect or dismiss. How could you not be as upset as I am? Like, what's wrong with you? How do you not find this so upsetting? Their buttons, their triggers, their reactions are kind of different. And I think one of the big challenges that comes up in family therapy and couples therapy and parenting is being able to kind of acknowledge some of those differences, but not feeling as like personally kind of invested, personally disrespected by it of, what? That pushes your button differently. It rings your bell differently. Sometimes that can be confusing. Let me understand why. But it can be kind of different. The other thing that gets complicated with emotions is we don't always share them and show them in the same way. So you and I might be upset. My upset might look completely different than your upset. And just because you don't look or seem as upset as I do, doesn't mean you're not feeling it. But it can be very confusing as adults and especially as children, right? Like, often we look for someone to match our emotions and it gets really confusing. How come you're not so upset by this? What's wrong? How do you know? Well, I just show it in different ways, right? So I might be upset, but I might not be the upset person that starts crying and making the big hand gestures. Or I might be mad, but my version of mad is really more of a quiet mad versus loud, I'm going to show you how mad I am. And trying to sort of pause and remember of like, okay, you show this in a little bit of a different way. You feel in a different way. That's okay. But let me you don't have to match me and mirror me on that. Does that kind of explain it a bit?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful explanation. So are you saying the entanglement usually happens when people take stuff too personally or become invested in other people's choices or reactions?
Well, so it's interesting, one of the words that I don't know if bristle is the right way to say it, people often say like too personal or you're overreacting. Those phrases kind of confuse me and I don't love them because of course we take things personally, right? Like we all operate, and especially when we're thinking about young kids, we start out, especially 6 to 12-year-olds, they're very egocentric. Like everybody feels what I feel. Everybody, like, of course, this is how I feel it. But here's the thing about our brains, even our brains, we still tend to work from our perspective, right? Our perspective is our perspective. So like, I'm upset by this. Why wouldn't you be upset by this? I feel this. Why wouldn't you feel this? And I think it's that, I don't know if it's too personally, but it's sort of, we have to remember that other brains, other bodies, other hearts and minds operate a little differently than ours. And I think what gets confusing and sort of what stirs it up is that difference can feel very threatening sometimes. That difference can be really problematic. And sometimes if we remember, like, what do I know about this person, whether it's my child or my friend or my colleague or my spouse, like, oh yeah, when I think about how they operate and how their brain operates and their family background, like, oh, it's a little different for them. And that's okay. One of the things that I often sort of say to parents in terms of when they're interacting with their children is kind of the best stance you can take is dumb and confused. And you don't even have to pretend to be it. Like, help me understand this. I don't get it. Like, I'm kind of confused, like, and dumb in the sense of like, I'm really not getting it, because sometimes other reactions, if we kind of pause and be a little curious about them rather than go to that place of being offended by them or disrespected, but be a little more open and curious of like, oh, this person's having a reaction that feels really different than mine, or is a reaction I wouldn't have anticipated. I wonder what that's about. Can you tell me what's wrong with you? Help me understand that. That's a really helpful stance, rather than that like, what is wrong with you? What, I don't understand you, but like, help me understand you. Help me get where you're coming from, because wow, I see it really, really differently. That's really interesting. Tell me what it's like for you. And I think especially with our children, we have to remember it does look very different from their perspective. They don't have the experience, they don't have the skills. And we can't impose how we feel, our experience, our perspective on them. We can try and drop some crumbs and maybe challenge them and expand a little bit there, but their experience is kind of their experience. And we need to, kind of appreciate where they're coming from, even if we don't fully agree with it, and even if we don't want to indulge it, but we can still kind of, in the moment, appreciate the feeling, even if we're going to challenge a little bit or question a little bit, sort of whether it's their conclusions or their realities from it. One of the terms that psychologists like to use a lot is called validation. It's a great term. It's used a lot in dialectical behavior therapy. And really the idea of validation, it's sort of like, I want to call it like cementing empathy, right? So the idea of validating is, I hear you, I see you. I don't necessarily agree with you, and I may not approve what you're doing, but I do hear you and I see you. So for example, if your child comes home, this was the worst day ever, Mom, school sucks, nobody likes me, I can't stand it, it's awful. Like, what's our initial reaction as a parent? It's usually like, oh, no, it's not that bad. No, honey, it's not that. No, come on, it's everyone likes you, it's not that bad. Which we kind of consider invalidating, right? We're sort of dismissing a little bit. And if everyone just went, oh crap, I just did that yesterday, my kid, don't worry, we invalidate people all the time. It happens. But the idea of validation is, I can appreciate, and I like that must be a terrible feeling. That sounds really awful. Oh, that's really hard, baby. I'm sorry to hear that. What a terrible feeling. So I'm going to validate your feeling, but I'm going to say, but let's think about this. Yeah, it is really bad. Let's see, do you think every single person in the school doesn't like you? Like, we can sort of gently challenge there, but the validation part is, look, when you're 9 or 10 years old, when you're 11 or 12 years old, sometimes when you're 17 or 18 years old and you have one of those days and you come home, like, that feeling is just, it's a terrible feeling. So we can validate that feeling, but then we can sort of challenge and expand maybe what they're doing, the thinking with that feeling. And look, validation is really a super important thing. And I think it's really important now, because our kids are feeling a lot of things of when, they're overwhelmed, when they're scared, we want to validate those feelings, but then we want to sort of help make sure that those feelings don't sort of misinfluence, if you will, how they're thinking about things. And where we have some more room to challenge is how they think about it. But the feelings, we want to make sure that we validate. You know, I think many of us, even as adults, if you're really upset or stressed about something or worried about something, and someone says to you, oh, don't worry about that, it's really, I think, you know, kind of an awful thing to say. It's a really frustrating thing. When someone says, don't worry, you know, I often feel like, well, that's great. If oh, why didn't I think of that? Like, oh, you could just turn off worry. How come I don't have that button? You know, like who has one of those buttons where someone can go, just don't worry about it. And you go, oh, I never thought about that. Oh yeah, don't worry. Oh, look, I stopped worrying. I'm great. Like it doesn't work that way. But you know what, if someone says, oh man, that sounds a lot. Let's think, you know, let's talk this through. Let's think about it. I don't know, is it so worry worthy, or like how you feeling about it, or what else we can do? So, you know, I think part of where it gets confusing with emotions is that, you know, that entanglement of our emotions, their emotions. I think the other thing that happens as parents that gets really hard, you know, and again, if we put this on a good day, having our children wrestle with uncomfortable emotions, seeing our children struggle is really, really challenging. You know, like it's miserable as a parent to see your child hurting or struggling or anxious or stressed or upset. It's a terrible feeling. You know, what's our first instinct is usually of, I have to fix it. I have to make that better. I don't want my child to hurt. I don't want my child to be uncomfortable. And we go really quickly to that soothing, solving place. You know, like, let me make it better. Let me solve it. Part of right now, there are so many emotions going on. And you know, when we think about going to that place where we want to soothe it or solve it or fix it, right now we're a little compromised too. We may not have the full energy to be able to do that. And especially right now with the pandemic, we can fix it. You know, like there's a lot of stuff that is way out of all of our control right now. I think it leaves us as parents feeling really uncomfortable. So often when we very quickly go to that, let me make it better, let me make it all right, we kind of move a little too quickly to the feeling. And some of what's really important is just to kind of sit with these feelings sometimes and let our kids express them. And sometimes you know, what we really can do is just listen. And for a lot of people, it can feel like I should be able to do more. Like listening isn't enough. I should be able to do something. Listening is doing something, and listening is really valuable. I mean, think about as adults, you know, a lot of times we can share something with a friend or a loved one or a colleague, and, you know, it's really hard. We're usually not looking for them to do anything. We usually don't have, like, we kind of know they don't have any magic to make it better. But often just that experience of someone sitting and listening to you, like letting you cry, letting you be angry, letting you vent, and someone just staying there with you for it. And especially if they can put an arm on you or a hug or sort of look at you as you're doing it, even on a phone call of, hey, I just need 5 minutes to vent, that's really powerful. There's something very cathartic. There's something very healing and soothing about that. And I think sometimes as parents, we forget that with our kids, and we go so quickly to that other place. And some of it is like, wait a second, let me just sit here and listen to you and just listen. And I, you know, again, it's almost like you kind of want to do this and not jump in so quickly. You know, one of the things you can say, especially as your kids get older, is just asking them, is there anything I can do? You know, one of the phrases that I often kind of teach parents, and I use it with my own kids, especially as they get older and they get more articulate and verbal, is kind of like, what would you like me to do this? Because is this one of those where, do you want me to be like the problem solving mom? Because I got tons of it. You know, like, I love to solve a problem. Like, if you're ready for that, we can jump in. Or do you just want me to be the, like, listen to you, like, empathize, sympathize mom? Because I can be that too. And, you know, depending on your child, depending on the issue, depending on the context, sometimes we look for different things. Sometimes we do want the, like, help me with this. Sometimes I just listen. And explicitly asking our kids that, explicitly letting them know, you've got some options here. Like, let me listen to you. And then kind of saying to them, hey, if you want some ideas for what to do about that, I might have a few, if you're, you know, if you want to listen, if you're interested in that. Or, man, that really stinks. Sometimes just saying, man, that stinks. That sounds really awful. That's really powerful. That's really valuable. before I keep going, other questions, other comments, other things people have been struggling with right now, given all that's going on?
Michelle, we have one question here in the chat, but just a little bit of thing just so you know, we're at 10:15, and I don't know if anyone has high schoolers, but school ends at 10:30 today. So anyone that might, again, it is recorded, or if you have a question you want answered before you have to drop off, you can put it in the chat privately to me or to everyone. Here's a question. What about the child with sensory issues who doesn't necessarily look at the teacher, is busy fidgeting with fidgets, so doesn't always pick up on visuals, eye, body language, etc.? How do you help them with picking up communication?
Sure. And you know, what's really interesting is people naturally some people are different in terms of the cues they naturally pick up on. You know, what's interesting, even on these Zoom calls, some people are happy to be on screen, some people don't want to be on screen, you know, like some people are sensitive, some people are a little harder time with that. And I think especially in the sort of Zoom world we're living in now, and especially with so many kids needing to be on screen, it's important that we kind of think about our own kids and cue in teachers of what our kids are like, because some kids do get really self-conscious on Zoom. Some adults get self-conscious on Zoom, and it's not just like, oh, I didn't do my hair today, or I want to be doing other things. Sometimes it's like, I really want to listen, but I don't want everyone to be looking at me. I think for kids that there are many kids that need it's how they regulate in a lot of ways, is to sort of focus in or use something. You know, one of the things you can do is games like charades and like feeling charades that you can play with your children to encourage them to look at cues and like, hey, look at my eyes right now. What are my eyes doing? Or, you know, sometimes we used to do this with the younger kids, of where you can play a game where you can actually turn your back, say what I'm feeling, where they can't even see. So then they really have to listen to, like, okay, listen to my voice. How does my voice sound when you can't even see my face? Or, you know, maybe I am going to cover my face, but look at the rest of my body. Look at my hands. And you can cue your children of, if you say, okay, so you're going to have to guess my emotion without looking at my face. What do you think you could use for that? Well, let's see, listen to the tone of my voice. Look at my hands, look at my body language. So you can cue your child a little bit to that. I would also encourage, right now is a really important time to reach out and talk to children's teachers. It is harder for teachers right now, and having been a teacher, you know, those first few weeks in school where you have the kids and you're really getting a great sense of how they are and getting to know them, we've lost a lot of that data, in part because many schools right now are doing a hybrid, so they're not getting as much time. Kids are masked, there's more anxiety in the air. So it is harder for a lot of teachers to get to know these kids. So I think proactively reaching out to your child's teacher and letting them know there might be some ways that the teacher can either subtly or gently cue your child to do some of that, of, you know, so I'm going to ask you a question. There are some other practice things you can do. You know, one of the things that I do with some kids when I do individual sessions of kids that have a harder time sort of attending to me, especially on a screen, I often play, it's kind of like a Where's Waldo game or Find the Difference. So we'll play a game where I'll say, okay, all right, look at me, look at what I'm wearing, you know, look at where I'm sitting, and then I'll block the screen for a minute. And then when they come back, I've either let my hair down, or maybe I've taken off my necklace, or I've taken a picture away behind me, and it's like, okay, what's different? And then I give them a turn to do it. So even that's a little bit of practice of cueing in to pay attention to what's going on. I do think it's important, though, to respect the fact that and sort of acknowledge there are a lot of kids and adults, for that matter, that have a hard time sitting still, making eye contact in person, and have a really hard time doing that via screen. So for some kids and for some adults, being able to take a break of where I am going to turn off my camera for a minute, and maybe I'm going to go over here and do 10 jumping jacks or a few push-ups, or just sort of get my wiggles out. Or, you know what, I have something in my hands that I'm playing with, you know, and making sure that kids recognize that's okay, and sort of how can they cue and let someone know they're going to do that, and making sure teachers recognize that's not my child sort of zoning off or being disrespectful. That's actually something they do. It's kind of an intentional break that they do to regulate. So hope that kind of answered. Any other questions? Any other things that people are wrestling with? One one of the other, and actually we got to some of these, you know, I think the other thing that can be really helpful as we're trying to manage many of these emotions is that just because someone else, whether it's your child, whether it's your spouse, whether it's your colleague, is having a ton of emotions, you know, I say here, you don't have to ride the roller coaster with them. I think emotions are contagious. You know, I think I said in one of the earlier slides, emotions like get out there and they get everywhere. And we, especially with our children, we're super attuned to their emotional state, which can be really hard to manage. You know, it can be really hard to manage whether if your kid's in a terrible mood or your kids are fighting and you sort of get caught up in it. They tend to switch, many children, on and off a lot more quickly than we do. So like they'll come in now and they're fine and you're like, I'm not over that yet. Hold on, guys. Like I'm still catching up. We don't necessarily have to feel what our kids are feeling. We can be empathic, we can be validating, we can be supportive without riding that roller coaster. And in fact, when our kids are super flooded and super emotional, or our partners or our spouses or our own parents or anyone else we come into contact with, it's actually, we're better off staying on the ground. You know, if they want to go on the roller coaster and do the loop-de-loops and go round and round, that's great. Our best place is on the ground, solid ground. We can hold their stuff. And if they come off all dizzy and flooded, we're actually in a better place to help them on the ground rather than riding the loop-de-loops with them. And that gets really hard. And that kind of goes back to that entanglement issue of, all right, my kid's having a really hard time right now. Whew, I sort of have to like hold on and hold steady. If I jump in there with them, you know, two of us flooded doesn't help. So let me do my best to kind of like appreciate their emotions, see where they're coming from, but I'm going to try and stay here. And so that's really, really hard to do, especially going back to that idea of buttons, if sort of it's something where you're getting really into it too. So it does help, you know, the idea of like taking a deep breath, the idea of like remaining calm, the idea of remembering like, I don't have to jump in, let me slow this down. Those are all really helpful things to do. They're super hard when you're tired, you're stressed, you haven't had enough to eat, you know, and that's where all the good basics of we need to take good care of ourselves and make sure that we, especially right now, are sort of well rested, well fed, have those moments where we can sort of let it out. Then we can handle some of those emotional ups and downs of our kids better. And you know, this idea also of listening is really important. And if we pause before we jump in, because sometimes when we jump in either too fast, where our kids feel like you're not listening, or they feel, especially if we're not listening, they tend to get louder and more emotional because they want us to get our point. Sometimes that sort of idea of being quiet, giving them space to let it out can be really helpful. And, you know, I think the other thing we want to be careful about is we think about emotions, right? And we think about our brains. There are kind of two parts of our brains, and they kind of not necessarily fight each other, but we work to be balanced. So we have, you know, and Dan Siegel talks about this, and lots of people talk about this idea of sort of wise mind, when our sort of emotional brain and our thinking brain are in balance, if you think about a seesaw. When our emotional brain takes over, our thinking brain gets really quiet, right? That's where I'm flooded with emotions. I can't really think about anything. Unfortunately, most people try and get that emotional brain to calm down by don't worry, don't stress, don't worry about it. That doesn't work very well, right? Because when we're flooded with emotions, that nice logical thinking brain that's going, it probably isn't a big deal, is talking really quiet. And our emotional brain is, it's the biggest deal ever. You can't hear it. One of the better ways is, you know, we want to try and get that thinking brain back online, because that's going to bring our emotional brain down. But if you try and go at it directly with logic and reason, the emotions are too strong. You can't get it to do. So that's why sometimes almost like giving it time to sort of dilute, or sometimes if kids are really emotional and flooded, almost giving them something else to do, especially if it's in that early stage where they're trying to go on. So some of it is like physically giving all that emotion a place to go by saying, let's go run around, or let's go do jumping jacks. Or sometimes rather than going right to logic and reason of like, let's think about this realistically, like not getting picked for the soccer team is really not going to ruin your life. If you go at it directly, can't do it. But if you sort of give them something else to do, give them something else to focus on, And then when they're a little more balanced, that's where you can have that discussion about it. And sometimes, you know, again, physical activity is great for kids. Of, man, you seem really upset. You know what? Let's go do a ton of jumping jacks. Let's go up and down the stairs 12 times. You know, let's hop on one foot. Let's see how many times we can toss this koosh ball back and forth without dropping it. Let's give that energy something else to go. That kind of brings everything back in line. Now we have a time to talk about it. And that can be really challenging, and those are kind of hard strategies to remember, especially in the moment, but they do come in handy, and kind of the more we practice them a little bit, when the emotions are a little quieter, then we can access them a little bit when things get kind of flooded. So, and I'm happy to talk more about specific strategies, but again, I just wanted to check in as we're winding down to see if there were other things that people had questions about or comments or issues. So, you know, one of the other, and Stacy, I can't see the chat. I don't know if, I think because I have all this stuff up. But did anything else come in the?
We have one more question here. How can you help your child when they are in the middle of a meltdown, tired after school, etc.? And how can you help them be emotionally and physically ready to start homework?
Oh, that's the big question. All right, so the hard part is I wish I had the perfect recipe to say, oh, here's exactly what to do and it will work every time. And I even wish I had the cookbook that said like, oh, 11-year-old girl, tantrum in the morning, here you go, this is for you. Early on, I will share, early on when I had sort of just moved to town and I was just starting my practice, I think my daughter was probably around 6, and the way I know this is she was really into the princess phase where like we couldn't go to the grocery store unless she was in the full tiara, the tulle, the wand, tons of plastic jewelry, and like her little princess shoes. And we were in Whole Foods in Westport, and I think I had made the mistake of trying to go grocery shopping when it was too close to nap time and she was too hungry and too tired. And she had a major meltdown and literally threw herself on the floor of Whole Foods with the whole tiara and the wand and the shoes and everything. And I remember looking at her and she was like yelling, crying. And I had a few thoughts. One, you know, of course, I did have the my poor kid thought, it's got to be miserable to feel that way. I also had the me thought of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose all my clients if anyone who knows me walks into this Whole Foods and sees my kid on the floor, like there goes my whole practice. And I had some of the feelings of like, oh my gosh, what kind of parent am I that my kid's like on the floor? And I remember another mom actually walking by and sort of looking at me and sort of going like this and just sort of smiling, going like, it'll be okay. And I was so thankful for that mother, like to this day. And I wish I had ever seen her again because I would, well, these days I wouldn't run up and hug her. But, you know, I was so thankful that rather than like judgment or condemnation, she sort of gave me that empathetic of like, hang in there, you got this. You know, the hard part is when kids get so flooded, or adults for that matter, in that moment, there isn't so much you can do. You know, the intervention, if you will, in that moment is to kind of give them a safe space to let it out and sort of wait till that wave recedes. Another colleague I know who's done some work on temper tantrums, his favorite one that he talks about is where a child had a temper tantrum because their family had a round table, and the tantrum was about where was the head of the table, because the kid wanted to be at the head of the table, but it's a round table, so there's no head. Like in that moment where kids are so flooded emotionally, it is, you just have to wait to the wave to recede. I think what we really want to do is when that wave recedes and they're a little more calmer, that's a great time to say like, whoa, what happened there? What was that about? Even for young kids to have that discussion of like, wow, that seems really hard and really exhausting. Like, whew, that was a lot. What do you think happened there? And to kind of debrief and pull it apart. On the flip side, there's a lot of prevention you can do, you know, that second part of your question, to really kind of think about helping our kids learn skills early on to better regulate, to better manage their emotions. And, you know, one of those things we can do is talk in that language of emotions a lot. So get very comfortable at that idea of starting to really talk about, even if you can't completely articulate what feeling you're having, but just that, so like, how's everybody feeling today? And not just that idea of, you know, I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling mad, but like, how you feeling in your body? Because emotions have that energy component. So like, are you feeling sort of high energy? Or are you feeling low energy? My colleague, Mark Brackett, part of his mood meter on the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence really tries to really look at that energy component. So there's like, how does your body feel? Do you feel like tense and tight, or do you feel kind of relaxed? Do you feel like good in your body, or do you feel a little edgy or uppity? Do you have butterflies anywhere? The flip side is, you know, can you put some names of some of those feelings? Is this like a more positive or a good feeling? Or is this, even with little kids, we can use words like yucky or not good feeling. So helping kids like pay attention and cue in early on, because the earlier we can identify how we're feeling, where it's coming from, the less likelihood it's going to go to that point where it blows. So whether that's a little bit of like your breakfast conversation or your after school conversation, or sort of you start talking about it, not just asking your kids, but it's kind of a family thing of like, all right, how's everyone feeling in their belly today? How's everyone feeling in their brain today? To make that part of the conversation. You can also help by, most of us have tells, and most of us know our kids' tells in terms of when those emotions are starting to brew or boil. So, you know, sometimes you do see that little fidgety, sometimes you see the shoulders start going up, sometimes you see that look around. If you see that emotionality starting to kind of ebb up a little bit in one of your children, that may be a good cue for, okay, come on, let's get some wiggles out. Let's go again. Let's go climb the stairs. Let's go run outside. Let's see if, you know, one of my favorite games is the alphabet game. For some of those older kids, the 10 to 12, let's think of the letter A. How many foods can we think about that start with A? Let's see, there's asparagus, there's avocado, there, you know, coming up with things to kind of get their brain to slow down a little bit. And if we can slow down that emotional rise, then we can talk about the emotions a little bit better. So some of those are kind of helpful strategies. And then it's also back to the basics. All of us, the more sleep we get, the better we eat, you know, those are going to help us manage and balance our emotions better. That when we're tired, when we're hungry, we're all over the place. And sometimes if you kind of see your kid getting all edgy, you know, sometimes the best thing to do is, even before we go to the emotional discussion of, here's some carrots and hummus, here's some cheese and crackers, let's get something to eat on board, and then let's talk about some of those emotions. And you can gently even say to a child like, hey, it seemed like after you had that snack, you felt a little better. That's what it kind of looked like to me. Did it feel like that to you? Especially with young kids, partly what we want to do is they may not be putting all these cues together. So we want to help them connect the dots by talking to them and sort of showing them a little bit of that. I think that was a really long-winded answer. I'm not sure if it even got to the question completely, but anything more to it? Anything else?
I don't have any more questions in the chat, Michelle.
Okay. You know, I think the other, just sort of as we wrap up, these are really complicated, hard times. You know, I would say September is my favorite month of the year weather-wise, but it tends to be my least favorite month just for feeling-wise, because it always feels a little scattered to me. There's always a little bit of that melancholy, we're going back to school. There's always a little bit of that kind of haven't hit my groove, off my game, who's supposed to be where, schedules, we're kind of figuring this all out. You know, this year, I think that's been magnified by the fact of kids haven't been in school for 6 months. We're going back to school in a totally different kind of way. You know, I think emotions are kind of all over the place right now. And I don't say that in an excuse way, but just in a, okay, part of that empathic understanding explanation way, to recognize of this is a hard time for kids. There is a lot going on, and it's a hard time for us as parents. And I think if we can all kind of take as best an exhale as we can and try to be a little more understanding, a little more curious about how everyone's doing, how everyone's feeling, and sort of pace ourselves a little bit and recognize this is challenging. And we're going to figure it out together, and we're going to get through it together. And that doesn't mean we're always going to do it right or get it right, but we're going to kind of do the best we can and try and do that and remind our kids that too. And part of that is, as parents, is giving ourselves permission of, well, doing the best we can probably always do better. And it's kind of taking that breath and not beating ourselves up when we don't do the best, but recognizing like, and owning it with our kids of, man, I was really a little grumpy yesterday. I was really tired and really stressed. I got some good sleep last night. I'm going to eat really well. I'm going to go to my exercise class today or do a little extra yoga, and I'm going to try this again. And trying to hold ourselves, think about, use that mantra for ourselves, and try and impart that mantra on our kids too. One last, going through these, just a few other, and Stacy, we can share these with people if that's helpful. Child Mind Institute, it has a great website with a lot of great resources for sort of coping during COVID and managing emotion. Harvard has a great, they have something, the Developing Child series, which also has some really nice ones. Both the Harvard one up here is really focused on helping kids manage emotions, helping kids express emotions, especially younger kids, how to engage them in talking about some of these things. So that's a particularly helpful one. And then there were some interesting articles. The New York Times has been doing a really nice job highlighting articles about kind of social and emotionally how COVID is impacting us and our children. So those are three really nice resources to share. So there you go. Thank you all for listening and coming. And I can hang out a little bit, Stacy, here. I know, want to be mindful that people may have things to do, but I'm happy to hang out for like another 10 or 15 minutes if people have additional questions or comments that I can help answer or address.
Okay, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Michelle. Just a little bit of housekeeping again. We will share these on our website, and we will also send out Michelle's presentation to you all, and along with the recording. If there is anyone that would like to stay and ask some questions or put them in the chat, feel free. If not, I think I'll just say a huge thank you, Michelle. This was very helpful as a mom of 3 as well, and we were very happy to have you.